Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's Fireside Chat, the revenue drain you can't see. I'm Tara Benyuski, VP of Marketing here at OnRamp. We're excited for our customers and all of the new folks that have joined us today. Around here, we talk a lot about onboarding and how it's more than just a handoff or a step, and is really one of the most important moments that can make or break a customer's long-term success and has a significant impact on a business's revenue, and yet it still often doesn't get the attention it deserves. So today we're diving into the silent revenue killers that hide in plain sight during onboarding and how customer success leaders can use this stage and turn it into a true competitive advantage. We'll dig into some real examples, some strong opinions, and actionable strategies, followed by a live Q&A. And be sure at any time during the event to drop any questions you might have in the chat. And as I'm able to get to them, I will try to queue them up along the way. And joining me today are two powerhouses in CS and post-sale strategy, Diane Gordon and Laura Carpentier. And I'll turn it over to them to provide quick introductions to them.
Go ahead, Laura.
Sure. Thank you, Diane. And thank you, Tara, for that great introduction. And pleasure to be here. I'm Laura Carpentier. I've been in the customer success space now for 5+ years, formerly a practitioner of customer success in the enterprise domain. I've run the commercial segment and then currently head up global customer success at Audit Board. Very excited to talk today about customer onboarding. It's one of the most important factors to scaling. And I'm excited to be with Diane. Diane, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. And thank you to Tara and OnRamp for inviting me to participate. I've been in the SaaS, post-sale SaaS space for coming up on 30 years now. Yep, that is how old I am. And so I've spent the last, 25, 27 or so years building and scaling post-sales teams across all of the post-sale motions, including onboarding, a very critical thing for various companies in a CCO role. In the last 2.5, 3 years, I left corporate to start my own consulting business and have quickly become enamored with a few tools as I've gotten more time to dig in. And one of them is OnRamp, because I think they sort of really captured this critical thing that is usually just a step in a path for most companies. So I'm excited to talk about that today.
Excellent. Thank you both so much. And just by way of housekeeping, yes, we will definitely send out the recording of today's session within 24 hours of today. So please watch your email for that. And then just a quick backdrop before we dive in. I think for many, onboarding can feel like it's almost deceptively simple. You just schedule a quick kickoff call, you assign a few tasks, and you move along. But in reality, this onboarding phase holds some of the earliest signs for long-term risk. So let's start there. Diane, I will cue the first question up to you to kick us off. What is one of the early warning signs that you've seen that a customer is potentially going to churn?
I think that for me, the most critical one is, and especially for B2B, is you get in that kickoff session with the customer and you say to them, our understanding is that you bought because of, you're expecting these outcomes, or you don't have any reason, you don't know why they bought. Either one of those reasons, if they respond to either, yeah, we don't know what the outcomes are supposed to be either, or no, that's wrong, the ones you gave us are not what we thought, and by the way, that's because that guy always talks like that and we believe something different. So there's either a lack of or complete misalignment on what success looks like literally what by the end of onboarding, by halfway through their contract, will have happened for them in their business in terms of measurable results. That means they're happy. That's the very first warning sign. And it's amazing how frequently you jump into that kickoff call and you're like, all right, let's introduce each other. Now let's jump into the plan for onboarding. And no, you need to stop and say, our understanding is you bought because you expect outcomes A, B, and C. And if they go, oh, really? Because we don't know, or we're not sure. That's like right there. That's your first warning sign.
I agree, Diane. I think it's important to note here, just like there's a handoff process between sales and the onboarding team, whether that's customer success or if there's a dedicated implementation team, there's oftentimes a handoff between the economic buyer or executive sponsor and the team that will be responsible for handling the day-to-day. And everything Diane said is true. If there's a misalignment between the expectations of what was thought to be sold versus what is actually received is one thing. I'd add on to that, sometimes when you're dealing with a completely different team on the customer side, they may not be set up adequately to begin. They may not have the number of resources needed. They may not have the right resources needed. So even though you're ready to begin, they are not ready to begin. And there's a significant lead time that has to happen on their side in order to be equipped to begin the onboarding process.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, if we're still, do we have time to talk about a couple more, Tara, or?
Absolutely.
I would absolutely jump on board with the one that, that's a great, you sort of lay out the onboarding process and they go, oh, wait, we don't really have anybody who deals with those integrations, or they're not, we're going to have to put that in a long queue of Salesforce requests. And, that's early warning signs, 100%. I think the other thing is that when you run into a bump like that one, or like value's not clear, and you can't get the buyer back on the phone, either with you or the person who sold them, they're just unavailable, another bad sign. So, either of those first two things, and then you go, all right, we need to circle the wagons here, bring everybody back together and understand what we're trying to do and the resources that are required. And your AE, whoever sold it, can't get the person on a call, yeah, you're in trouble.
And I think one last thing I would add, I don't know if you've experienced this, Diane, or anyone who's joining today, but sometimes the team itself ghosts you, right? It's really hard to get a hold of. I hate to say it, like you're trying to set up time with them and you think you're engaging with the right people, but they don't have the time or it's not a priority. And you're doing a lot of the chasing and they're just not following up, right? So I think all of those things are really good indicators that it's not starting off on the right foot necessarily.
And I think in those cases, mistake that teams make is like, they're trying to be really polite, right? Of course you should, they're the customer and you're not. You're reaching out, I'm going to try again in a few days. Like, you need to be bold. These people just wrote you a big check, and you need to get back to whoever the buyer is and say, we're concerned because you're not going to get your money's worth unless you engage with us. So the longer you let that go out of politeness, and well, you don't want to be too pushy, that you're actually doing them a disservice. So I'm not saying like that should be your first go-to, right? But, don't do the, yeah, we invited in the call, we didn't show up, so we sent a message, it's been 3 days, I'm going to send another message in 2 weeks,
Yeah.
you still haven't reached them. It's time to escalate, right?
Yeah, I think that is probably the biggest thing, Diane, that is one of the best practices that I've seen is not utilized as often as it should, which is escalate early. There is a hesitancy, I should say, to raise the alarm. Most often at this crucial stage, you either have not had the ability to set a communication cadence cross-functionally yet, or you are unsure how much time to give before you raise that flag. And oftentimes it will be sometimes weeks before someone says, hey, I just can't get on the calendar. But the thing we have to remember about onboarding is it's really meant to be a stage. It's the introductory stage of a new relationship, but that stage is a part of a contracted service. And when you lose that time up front, you can't get that time back. The best you can do is try to squeeze more in latter stages, but that loss of initial alignment or communication or engagement really starts you down, to your point, Tara, the path towards dissatisfaction, churn, because you're losing that time, which means the customer is not able to see value along with the expectations of when their executive sponsor thought they would be seeing value by.
Or, flip that around to the positive, imagine that you buy a subscription to something, a year-long subscription, and, it's a magazine, right? And it starts showing up and you don't read it for 6 months and then you get your renewal notice. You're like, but I haven't been reading it. I haven't been getting any value from it. That's exactly what happens when, if someone can get value pretty quick by onboarding quickly, by the time you start making those renewal calls, the value's already been determined. So the longer they take, the less likely it is that when that renewal manager calls, they're going to say, oh yeah, we totally love this thing. That's just not going to happen if onboarding is stalled.
This is great. So I just want to say, shout out to the folks on the call. If you've had these similar experiences, please feel free to offer commentary into the chat, because it will help give us a little bit of flavor of like where all of you have been as well. I think a lot of these experiences are very common, you know, across many organizations. So we'd love to hear from you. And again, please feel free to post those in the Q&A. So this is terrific. I'm going to jump us forward a little bit and get us right into the heart of revenue. So Laura, I'll post this one first to you this time. So
Sure.
have you seen a small onboarding issue, something that was small, spiral into big revenue loss?
Yeah, I'd say, one of the first things you want to do is make sure you understand the expectations of the services or product that is sold into the customer so that you can adequately prepare them for success. I'd say something small is whether it's an overstatement or understatement in terms of the quantity of product, right? That could be things like licenses or a particular product itself. You don't always have the benefit of knowing what the longer term vision of the strategy is. So sometimes it's not always right sized to where the customer is in current state. Now, at face value, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal in the beginning. But what happens is there's a scramble as you continue to either try to ramp a customer up or retrofit something in to make it work, right? Or you realize it's not sufficient in terms of what they have, or it's not meeting what they have. And you have to try to then develop a workaround that gives them the functionality or service that they were expecting or hoping for. All of these things, when you catch that early on, if not dealt with in a quick and expedient way, can lead to a lot of back end activities that then either ultimately end up being, a downsell or churn of a particular product, or a great dissatisfier because a customer realizes there was a misalignment down the road, and they want to make good on that, and then they start looking for concessions. So it's that first piece where the deal composition and deal size may have not been exactly what is needed for that stage of the customer journey to work, that if not caught, then can become a bigger problem down the road. Diane, what are your thoughts? Do you agree?
Yeah, no, I was going to say that the very first thing is, we all have this spidey sense, right? And sometimes you don't even need a spidey sense. It's just like in black and white. But you try to get together with the team that you're going to be onboarding or kicking off with, and they don't show up, or they do show up, and they kind of have this like deer in the headlights look. They're kind of confused about why the thing was bought, what the buyer is hoping for. We've all been in that situation. It's like, hey, we're really excited. And then they're like, yeah, we were told to do this. So, cool. And anytime you feel that, anytime your spidey sense is telling you that there's not a connection somehow between the buyer and this team or this person that you're working with, that it's really hard to recover from that if you just press ahead. You're 3 months in and that's still happening. And yeah, you're going through and they're stood up, they're using features, but still you got that feeling that it's like not that important to them. It's best to just call it out right away. Those will almost always churn, and you do end up, like Laura said, doing special things to keep them. It's like, we kind of knew, so now we're going to do a backflip to make sure they stay. And now we're going to, offer this weird feature so they stay, and you just don't want to get yourself into that situation. So listen to your instincts. Most people in CS roles are in those roles because they have very good personal instincts about what they're getting from other people kind of in the virtual room. And I'm always surprised when people don't kind of listen to those and go, it doesn't feel quite right here. Like technically we're checking off the boxes, but feel like we're really both pulling for the same thing.
Yeah, I think speaking of scrambling to add new features to fix expectations that maybe we're misaligned, it's a good time to shift over to like what is that one mistake that teams make in the handoff from sales to onboarding? And I'll limit to one per each of you. Diane, do you want to continue?
Yeah, I mean, I am just gonna glide over the sales does sell things that products can't do. Just like, that's your life of being in post sales. That happens. Like, there's no solution to that. Like, sometimes you have better sales leadership than others, but I'm gonna set that aside. But really it is a misalignment between, imagine that that your sales rep is with the customer and says, our product is gonna enable you to achieve 10% growth in revenue. Like, they say something and set an expectation that is just not true, right? Or is true over a very long period of time. And so having a common language, even if it's not some fancy value framework, some common language about what reps say in the slides, what's achievable as outcomes or, metrics that can change is true. That I think is more important than whether or not a feature is there. And so it's really about, if salespeople are using the standard deck and they're not saying things like, we can get this done for you in, 2 minutes. So I would just say adherence to, sort of the rules of the road for talking to customers during the sales cycle. Not saying you can't promise, and salespeople will promise features, they'll promise things sooner rather than later. They shouldn't promise outcomes that are
Yeah. I think also in the spirit of trying to provide value to a prospective customer, sometimes there's a tendency to overstate the roles of the post-sales team, specifically almost setting up expectations of what roles like your onboarding manager, your customer success manager, your technical account manager, as examples, will be doing for you on an ongoing basis. Sometimes when those roles are not explained thoroughly, there's a misalignment in expectations that customers have. So once they begin the onboarding process, they feel like, I have a person now, I know that person by name, I know how to reach them. They are my go-to for everything and anything, right? And a lot of times that's not the case. People have specific roles and responsibilities that they need to deliver against. And when the customer is not clear on who to engage with and why, a lot of times there's a thought of, I'll just throw everything at this team and they'll figure it out. And if not, to Diane's point earlier, if you don't catch that early, if you don't go and have that conversation early, that can become a dissatisfier, right? Then the customer feels like you're not serving me the way I thought I was going to be engaged, right? I thought I was going to have somebody working with me when I had a question, right? And that may not be the case depending on the particular customer segment or type, etc. So that is really important as well, and does happen sometimes during the handoff process from sales to onboarding, an overstatement of what the post-sales team will be doing in order to kind of placate and keep the customer happy.
Oh, for sure. So thank you. So we are going to shift a bit here now and think about how we should be rethinking post-sale as a growth strategy and how onboarding can accelerate that time to value, time to adoption, and upsell readiness. And think about things like maintaining momentum and what the power that momentum has in setting that tone, or strategies to keep your executive sponsors engaged. Thinking of things like, how do you de-risk any kind of misalignment that maybe did happen in that sales to CS handoff? So think of those things like as we go into the next set of questions here for you. And the next one would be like, how have you seen great onboarding drive expansion or early upsells? Like, what is the connection between that great onboarding experience and that early expansion?
Do you want to take this one first, Diane?
I keep coming back to, imagine a scenario where the sales rep has said, with our product, the solution you can achieve, you drive these kinds of outcomes for your business, whether those are, decreased support time, pick the set of internal, company metrics that they will change. You say that to the customer's project team and they say, yeah, those are the ones. So there's initially this alignment on like, what things, what needles we're trying to move on what dials. Without that, it's just going to be, you're just going to be about like, let's get you using as much as possible. But imagine that you do that, right? And then what you can do is in your onboarding, focus on the things that will move one of those dials as quickly as possible. Maybe not get to its target, but by the time onboarding is done, you're like, oh, that needle has gone from current state to halfway to where we're hoping it will be. That one thing means your customer at onboarding end will be open to talking about a renewal or expansion because you've delivered something, but it has to be crisply defined. It can't be like, it can't be squishy. I always use that term. It can't be squishy. It can't be, yeah, we bought because we thought your product would help us produce products with fewer bugs. All right, well, did we baseline how many bugs you have in your current development release? What percentage of your code are bugs today? Did we baseline that? Okay, now let's look at the parts of our product and onboard you to the ones specifically that affect that metric first, right? And then let's keep measuring it. By the time you leave onboarding, you start to see, oh, yes, it's actually working. So the clear alignment on how you're going to, what the things you are, the values you're going to look at to assess whether it's worth the money, and starting with, don't onboard everything. Don't show them every feature in their product. Show them the ones that help them with that metric first, get them to that improvement, and then you go on to maybe a second phase onboarding later. They don't need to know the whole thing. So that is, that is the best way to enable expansion early, is to get to something measurable that's like, oh boy, I'm really glad we have this. And it can't just be, oh, we love your team and that training's been really good. Can't be the squishy things. Has to be something you can measure.
Yeah. And I think Diane brings up really good examples of how to drive depth of penetration with the current user you're working with for what they have purchased and what you're onboarding them around. What I've seen also is situations where many times a product or service is bought into a particular functional area of an organization. When we educate early about the breadth of a platform, oftentimes you can reach other users and personas that may not be a part of that first buying group. And when they start to get exposure to other products or other services, not the ones necessarily that were a part of the initial offering, it's almost an aha for them. And they realize, wow, I didn't realize you had these capabilities, or this could be applied over there. And so that I've seen work really well for breadth of expansion, right? Bringing in other functions, other buying groups within the same organization outside of the immediate one that you're working with for that. You're building advocacy, right? You want to build advocates with the first team or the initial group that you're working with. And that advocacy in the trust and confidence to everything Diane said around proving out those actions early on allows that word of mouth to spread in an organization, so that when you get to things like the renewal period or an early upsell, you have more voices and more enthusiasm for a product that they might not have been aware of it at the initial deal stage. And so that much more appetite and energy can lead to expansion opportunities.
Yeah, I would like to add one thing, because I realized, as soon as Laura began speaking, like, when you're having that value conversation with the customer, my favorite thing to do, and it's like, imagine you're in a restaurant, you put up the whole menu. Here's all the possible outcomes that our solution can drive in your business, right? Which ones are the most important to you? And they say, oh, number 2 and number 8, but they've seen the whole list. And they're like, we want all of those. We want number 2 and number 8 first, but they've now seen what's possible. Right, so you don't just show them, you go, what's interesting, and they tell you and you leave it. You show them the whole list every time. It's like, show them all the product offers. You walk into, it's the classic, you go to the old days, you'd go to a shoe store and, somebody you'd say, I want a pair of black patent leather, and they bring you 8 things to choose from, right? Because they really want you to buy more things. So you show them all the possible outcomes your product can provide, and they see, yeah, we really care about these 2, but geez, I didn't know, and I know somebody else that might be interested in number 12 and number 18. So, you're always selling. You're not just delivering what they ask for, you're showing them what else is possible.
And so Diane, you mentioned the word squishy, and I think that's a great transition to getting away from the squishy and actually into the things that are measurable and the things that matter. So let's get into the heart of our discussion on measuring what matters and aligning onboarding metrics with revenue outcomes. So question, just to set the baseline, like what onboarding metrics do you track that you think actually correlate to revenue?
Well, if you mean retention, I'll start with retention. I think
Mhm.
you look at how long onboarding should take for the use case that the customer is doing, or use cases, and if it should take 60 days, and literally you're anywhere at any point 5% or more off from where they should be in that timeline, right? So what, in terms of what tasks and meetings should have happened, what features they should have tried, if they are at any point more than 5% off of that, that you're at risk of churn like that. That's especially early on. And if you kind of get to the end and there's a few like lagging things, it's not usually that critical. And same in terms of revenue, because again, if they're not keeping up, they're not going to get to the outcomes by the time they leave. So you have to be religious about, by the end of week one, they should have done these 5 things. If they've only done 3, red flag. If they're I'm always amazed at how little tracking and reporting is done on those granular pieces of onboarding, because it just matters so much. It's such a limited time to get it right. And so that's what I stick to, and it's not just, hey, we should be 50% done and we're only 40% done. When you're at 10%, you should be 10% done, right? And you really need to get pretty granular there, because Laura, you probably agree, like it can start going well, it can go off the rails in a heartbeat.
Mhm. Yeah.
And so it could have been just fine yesterday, and all of a sudden today, whoop, something's not quite right.
Yeah, I agree. I think the time to value for the first milestone is key. I think also delayed in onboarding starting is another metric, right? How long does it take from the time the contract is signed to when it is agreed onboarding should start? If that exceeds the agreed upon time frame, as Diane said, right, you can't ever gain time back. You can only lose time and try to make it up. That's another red flag. And I also say, so both of those are more quantitative, right, and focused on cycle time. So the other thing in measuring an onboarding stage is engagement, right? Are they participating, right? You can measure that literally. Are they showing up to meetings? I used to run a scaled onboarding program because we were onboarding anywhere from 25 to 30 customers a month, right? So we couldn't do that in a one-on-one fashion. So in order to get customer feedback, we would have like in webinar surveys and interactions, as well as post-survey interactions, looking at, are people responding and what are their responses? So again, that proxy of engagement, responsiveness, and satisfaction early on also are key indicators of the breadth of the relationship and the likelihood of renewal down the road.
Okay, so segueing rather, what data do you wish you had earlier in the onboarding process to make some of those things that you're suggesting are critical to success? What do you wish you had earlier from a data perspective in the onboarding process?
I'll kick it off, Diane, if that's okay. If that's all right. Quantified business outcomes, right? What exactly are the use cases, processes, etc., and what is the expectation that we need to deliver to, right? If you know what the outcomes are, you can then put that up against your onboarding time frame, as well as your remaining contract duration and when the rest of your post-sales team will be engaged. Because then right off the bat, are you starting from behind? Are you okay, or are you ahead? Without knowing what the business outcomes are or having a quantified objective, you're going through the task, but you're not knowing, are you really making progress? So I'd say that's probably key.
Yeah. I mean, you're probably all hearing a theme here, which is, if the rep hasn't told you what outcomes the customer is trying to achieve by using your product, then, kind of all bets are off, right? And that means your company has to define what those outcomes are. And the AE has to go, yeah, we talked about these 10 and here's the ones they cared about. If that's not in place, even in a pretty casual way, your onboarding and everything that happens afterward is going to might be super busy and great, and the team will be happy, but they won't be interested in renewing or expanding. So yes, on that. But I would say the other thing that I wish is a little bit more of a map of the people and their personalities, and in particular, people who are blockers. So, there's always going to be people who are like, didn't think that their company should have bought this thing. And just knowing who those people are so that you can approach them carefully and thoughtfully, understand their role in making critical decisions. So just like a sales rep, they do typically an account map to understand who all the people are that they have to talk to get to yes. After that, post that, there's their mirror team behind that effort. Spending some time trying to learn that, as opposed to like figuring it out as you go, would be incredibly helpful. It's tough to do because most AEs are like, and for good reason, right? Coin operated, they've sold and they move on. But trying to get that insight in your handoff meeting, is there anybody that you met that is a real detractor that we should just know about? And how do they relate to the person that's running the project? Those kinds of questions can make your life as an onboarding person or a CSM so much easier.
I have a question from the audience here, just to add in a little bit more on the time to value question. So this person's curious to know your perspective on, is time to value the wrong outcome or the right outcome to measure? And maybe you can provide a little bit more color into like, what does that actually look like, and how is that a measurable, time that will build confidence that this project is on the right track?
So, Laura, I'll let you go here. The only time to value is awesome if value's been defined. And so time to value is thrown around a lot as a key metric, and it is a great metric as long as your company has defined what value means. So, I just finished a consulting engagement for a software company that builds software for trucker safety. They had to define, like, it can't be accident reduction because there's too many things that go into that, but it could be things like, the ability to look up a driver's safety score in another 30 seconds. Like, what is value? Why is the customer buying? If you haven't defined those, and it's really just going to be this, like, you get to the end of onboarding and go, well, do you think you're getting value? Then it's not a good metric to use. So unfortunately, there's some legwork that has to happen to define that company-wide, and then get the customer to select from that list so that you can then use it.
If it's okay, Tara, if I could add on to Diane's comment for that question of time to value, and also touch on the first question, which is getting the executive team to invest in onboarding. I'll kind of take those together, because when you think about onboarding in general and the investment in onboarding, there are finite resources that every organization has. Post-sales resources are no exception. If you have post-sales resources, you have to make the decision of what proportion do you put towards onboarding versus continual relationship maintenance and sustainment. To make the argument you need to put resources onto onboarding means you have to be able to show value. What is the difference, material difference, of having customers going through an onboarding process versus having customers figure it out on their own? And it doesn't matter if a product is meant to be as simple and straightforward as possible. If you're making the case to have formal onboarding, you have to be able to prove that. The situation is complex because to prove onboarding works means if you're waiting for the renewal period, you're waiting pretty much almost a year before you can prove, hey, by this customer being onboarded, they stayed with us, they're happier, and they renewed. Okay. And an executive is not going to wait a year to test out something, right? So having interim metrics like time to first deployment or first time to value is really important, because you need to be able to demonstrate progress, but more importantly, a material difference between the group of customers you're onboarding versus those that maybe aren't getting that same specialized treatment. So that is an important metric. It does have its problems, as Diane mentioned. If you don't have that defined from a business outcomes perspective, it's going to be difficult. If you're not using that, that's when you need to come up with other measurable metrics in the interim to look at the healthiness of your onboarding stage and the correlation of those metrics to longer term renewal, things like we talked about, engagement metrics, completion metrics, etc. So that would be the advice I would give. Come up with metrics that you can measure in the onboarding stage that can at least correlate to expansion or retention, because executives won't wait that time to make a decision to invest or not. And at least that gives you something that you can measure against in the interim.
Oh, that's great. And I think, that's one of the topics that comes up quite a bit with the customers that we talk with and just folks that we talk with every day is like, how do you actually show that onboarding impact to your CFO or to your CRO, who obviously has a very, vested interest in the overall health of the business, but may not be as close to the onboarding process as maybe the head of CS. And so is there anything more that, CS leaders can do to bridge maybe some of that gap or understanding of conveying that value from onboarding specifically to the greater health of the business when speaking with their CFO or CRO?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you're doing the work of capturing specific onboarding metrics like percentage complete against target for a customer, for example, and you have that data and you have churn data, you can look at customers that churned. And my very strong guess is that in many cases, if you produced a report that said, show me what their time to onboarding against target data was, you will see that there's a correlation. I mean, you should do it based on data. It shouldn't just be like, we know that, I mean, there's too much emotion, right? You will be able to tie churned customers with, not only did we know they were trouble from the start, but our time to onboard against target was off from the very beginning. And that you're going to see that correlation. And if you see that even 10% of the time, 20% of the time, that's all you need. You tie that to however much revenue that represented, it will almost always go, well, we need another onboarding person or something needs to change. So use the data that you have. It's not that hard. If you start tracking those onboarding metrics today, then when churn happens, you can go back and look and see, oh, this customer is at risk of churning, and look at they got a red for their time to onboarding against target. So you need to start tracking that as a critical health metric.
Diane, so on that, with the complexity of consistently measuring some of these outcomes, like how are you seeing the role of ops, like customer success ops, come into play here? Because it's a continuous initiative that has to be tended to. Like, are you seeing more and more ops roles?
Yes, absolutely. As organizations grow, and certainly for large companies, I think the work of it's just like a sales ops role, right? I mean, you've got sales management and salespeople, using a Salesforce to manage the pipeline, to do forecasts. That's all great. And someone needs to be constantly looking at the data to extract trends, to identify additional things you should be looking for, to raise the flag when something bad is happening, come up with new ways of reporting that would give you more visibility. That is tough for a full-time operating person to do, the larger your team gets. And having a CS ops person in place that is really comfortable with all the underpinning technology can say, hey, I'm seeing this data coming out of on-ramp. I'm seeing this data in our CRM. When I hold these, I see that we have a renewal challenge over here, and I see that their customer health score is currently yellow. Like, why is it yellow? Why is it red? Having an ops person that can focus on those. Sometimes that's combined into sales ops, but I think the role of CS ops has increased dramatically in the last few years. It's a huge, very, very important role.
I couldn't agree more. Honestly, CS ops, I think the role is really evolving. Everything Diane said, I can say personally, having formerly run the commercial segment, I used to have 7,300 or so customers globally. No way can you manage customers individually. And to the question in the chat around what does scaled onboarding mean, those themes that you see, you can really start to categorize and segment customers into cohorts and have a unified strategy on how you treat those customers as if they are one, right? In terms of a singular strategy. For onboarding, that could be grouping customers that all sign on to a particular product or service at the same time having them go through a unified onboarding program together as a group. It could be an expansion opportunity on a particular product that isn't sold into a similar persona of customers that you want to build awareness around. It becomes a sales play. CS Ops is fundamental for that. It's also the breeding ground, I'm finding, to the first forays into digital CS, right? Starting with things like Gainsight, I'll use that as an example. Journey orchestration of automated communications to help reduce the amount of manual communications sent individually by CSMs. Right? Your CS ops person is looking at that and figuring out ways to integrate technology into manual processes. So it is certainly a growing and vital function that will continue to evolve and be even more important as customer complexity increases and scale in digital becomes more important.
I think we're seeing similar trends, just given the amount of, I think, responsibility, now on onboarding and ensuring that companies get more of their customers from sign to success smoothly. So I think we're starting to see some of those trends also with the customers that we work with. And maybe in the last minute or so, we had someone ask, as someone who's rising into a customer success leadership role, like, is there one point of advice that you would part, with folks with that would speak to, if onboarding is that revenue drain that they're saying, like, what's that one piece of advice that you would give them to get in front of that?
You want to start, Diane?
Sure. I would say that, I know this is tough to hear for some people is, traditionally onboarding is about, telling the customer every possible thing they can do with your product, right? Like I have this analogy that I use where, you buy a new stove, and we just did, and it's induction. I don't cook at all, so I don't know why I use these analogies, but you buy, and it came with this massive manual of all the things a stove can do, the knobs, the dials, the settings, the this, the that, but doesn't teach you how to make a lasagna, right? And the same thing is true with software, right? So what we tend to do when we onboard customers, we read them the stove manual, read them the reference manual. Here's all the cool things, and look at this window and this button and this drop down and this thing. And what you really need to do is go, all right, what we heard is that you care about these two outcomes first of this beautiful list of 12 that you saw, because remember, those are cool too. Here's what you need to know to get to those two outcomes. We're not going to show you all the other stuff right now. That's going to be phase 2 of onboarding. Once we get you to this first value outcome, either the CSM does that or you loop back through onboarding. So the most important thing to do, if onboarding is so critical, is to make sure that your onboarding is about giving the customer what they need and not what you want to tell them. What you want to tell them does not matter. It doesn't matter if you know how to work everything in the product. What matters is if you can use it to do the things you care most about. And that's where most onboarding programs go wrong, is you have this, we got to get them through the list, we got to get through all the training, and no one remembers all that. They remember the stuff they need, and then they're going to call support for all the other stuff later anyway. So that's what I would say.
I don't know who asked the question, but they're after my own heart. I have to say that. I was actually in their situation not too long ago, and I had to make a business decision to reorient my customer success manager time to onboarding, because we could no longer handle customer relationships throughout the entire life cycle. And that bet to front load the time and attention to get onboarding right was important for all of the reasons we discussed in the first 45 minutes. But the key thing was not that after onboarding ended, we crossed our fingers, hoped for the best, and they went away. It's leaving them with a sustainability plan. Think of it like a compass, right? They are given direction from that point on of what they should do and how to get there. So they know how to follow that. That doesn't mean they're all going to make it. That doesn't mean they're going to not have questions, but it means if they have a guideline that they can follow from the time that they leave onboarding, the constant barrage back to the CSM starts to minimize. And then you have a check-in that you can do that's more time-bound and business-oriented, referencing back to that leave behind of their success plan, right? So you can better utilize post-sales team time by how you front load that time to onboarding and then leave them with a sustainable success plan that they can use autonomously on their own, just checking in periodically to make sure things are on track. So that would be the advice I would give to that person.
That's great. And I think just here as we're now at our time, I do want to say thank you both for sharing your insights with the folks on the call today. And of course, we would love to continue the conversation from here. Lots of good talking points, but I think good segue for further conversations from here. So on behalf of OnRamp, Laura and Diane, I do want to say again, thank you for everyone joining us today. And for those of you who are looking to take control of your onboarding strategy, we would love to show you, of course, how OnRamp can help. And in the next day, like I said, we will send out the recording of this webinar to refer back to. And until we talk again, thank you all again for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Laura, thank you, Diane.
Bye-bye.